have some very special sponsors that we like to acknowledge, including the Office of Research, Discovery, and Innovation at the University of Arizona, as well as TEP. We also have a number of other sponsors who have been with us for a very long time, some of them since the very beginning of this series. And as Joaquin will point out often, the reason that we're able to put it on in this beautiful hall and actually stream this live is because of the work of the sponsors. So just like to thank them for their work. I'd now like to introduce you to Kati Gotthard. Well, actually, I want to say one thing which is very interesting. If you've noticed that there's some really distinct things about the speakers that we've had this year. Probably, to me, the most interesting thing is the fact that except for one of our speakers, all the other speakers were actually born outside the United States. And they were actually enticed to come to a place like the University of Arizona because, I would say, the strength of the sciences here. Kati is also born outside the United States. She comes to us from Romania. There's a bit of a story. I'm not sure if I understand all of it, but we have a very distinguished Regents Professor, John Hildebrand, who is also actually now the Foreign Secretary for the National Academy of Sciences. And as far as I understand the story, he actually helped Kati escape from Romania to come to the United States and the University of Arizona so that she could get her PhD. Kati was brought. So she obtained her PhD here at the University of Arizona, and she continued her training in primate behavior and neurophysiology at the California National Primate Center Research Center in Davis. She came back to the U of A in 2002, and she established her research lab here. Her research explores brain mechanisms of social and emotional behavior. She pioneered naturalistic experimental paradigms that take advantage of the intelligence and of the social skills of macaque monkeys. Kati is a Kavli Fellow and recipient of multiple teaching and research awards. So one thing you might ask is, how does her story fit back into the context of searching for uncertainty? And her theme fits in because experts long believed that the brain was the sole source of our thoughts and feelings. And recently, it has become increasingly obvious that the physiological state of the body can become the source of mental processes. And searching for certainty about the contribution of the body to mental processes is essentially a search for causality and predictability in the brain-body dialogue. So I'd like to welcome Kati Gotthard.
Thank you for coming. And I hear that I'm unmuted, so you can hear me. Carl, when we're done with this lecture, please go talk to my husband. He'd like one of these muting devices. So in this lecture series so far, we have looked at how scientists go to various places to look for certainty. We have seen that we can find certainty in randomness and see how order emerges from chaos. And we have gone to the depths of the oceans and the farthest corners of the universe that the Hubble telescope can see, and saw things there. And then from this enormous scale, we came down to the microbial world of our intestines to understand how they make us who we are. And all these scientists, for all this work, used the same exquisite, fantastic scientific instrument, their mind. The mind is who we are. We all have one, and we use it all the time, but more or less. And we identify with that. We identify with that so powerfully that our mind is who we are. And nobody said this more succinctly than the 17th century mathematician and philosopher René Descartes. And Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," which is true. But then he also said a bunch of stuff that was wrong. He should have stuck to math. He decided that there is a boundary, there's a separation between mind and body, that the mind is something divine, esoteric, immaterial, and it can exist without the body. And then the body, the poor body, was thrown under the bus. The body is animalic. Actually, animals don't even have a mind, according to Descartes. And the body is mechanical, and the body can exist without the mind. Now here, Descartes might have been right, because it's just sufficient for you to go out after the football game to the bars of Tucson, and then you will see a bunch of bodies acting without the brain. And because I mentioned the word mind and brain, I want to make a disclaimer from the start. To the legitimate concern of philosophers and cognitive scientists, some of whom are our esteemed colleagues at this university, we can't equate the mind with the brain. I don't think they're the same thing. Nevertheless, in this evening, I will use these words interchangeably, because from the point of view of my story, it's sufficient for us to agree on the following. The mind is a product or a function or a property of the brain. It doesn't exist without the brain. And for a neuroscientist like myself, the question is, where are different mental functions localized in the brain and how they are carried out? So for the rest of the evening, mind and brain are going to seem to you that they're the same. And my story is the following. The content of our thoughts determines the state of our body, but also the state of our body determines the content of our thoughts. Now, the first half is an easy sell. Even undergraduate students buy it. Anybody who has been powerfully joyful or angry or scared knows that in that mental state, your entire body participates. Sure, because emotions are coordinated mind-body states, and you feel your heart jumping out of your heart the way I feel it now. Or your breathing changes, your throat changes, you have butterflies in your stomach, you sweat, you shake, you do all these things. Obviously, the body expresses the content of your mind. I will have a harder time convincing you of the second half of this, that the state of your body, including the state of your internal organs, is what determines the content of your thoughts. And the reason why I'm going to have a hard time goes back to what our first speaker, Joanna, told you on the first night, and that is the following. Our mind is set up by evolution to look for causes and effects and find these relationships, and they're very good at this. We're so good at it that we overdo it, and we attribute causes to effects that we notice, even if we don't understand the causes, and then many times we attribute the wrong causes. Just look in the newspapers. And then, and this is even harder for the mind-body dialogue, because we are aware of our mental life, more or less. We know that a memory came back in our mind. We know that we made a plan and we thought it through, and it's logical and it makes sense. We have access to this information, but we have no access to the information that is passed from the body into the brain. That flies under the radar. It doesn't reach the level of our awareness. Therefore, we cannot use it as a cause to explain our mental states. This is why when you're irritable and upset and grumpy, it is not your microbiome that you're thinking of, or your bone marrow, or a virus multiplicating somewhere in your body. It is your spouse who again didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher the way you like them. Right? So let me give you an example. Clever social psychologists did the following experiment. They have set up a mock interview, and the subjects of this experiment, whereas Joanna, randomized controlled trials, the subjects of these experiments were split in two groups. Half of them interviewed the job applicants in a wooden hard chair, And the other half interviewed the same people who gave the same answers, sitting in their nice, fluffy, comfy red chair. And guess what? When they analyzed the data, the people who sat in a hard chair thought that the applicant was rigid, set in his ways, kind of a hard ass. Whereas the applicant who was interviewed in the comfy chair, that applicant was flexible, easygoing, accommodating person. Let's ask the question, who did the thinking here? The brain or the part of the body that did the sitting? And before you say that you will not fall for this, let me tell you, beware of the comfy chair at the car dealership. Because if you negotiate in the hard chair, you drive a hard bargain. But if you sit in the comfy chair, you fork over a couple $100 for the same car. Moreover, you interview somebody, you put their resume on a heavy clipboard, and you're going to think, ponderous resume, good applicant. And then if they clip it on a lightweight clipboard, that person, she needs more experience to get this job. Okay, so if I convinced you that the physical aspects of our body takes the physical aspects of the environment and translates them into social attributes, into mental attributes through this process called embodied cognition, I would like to take you further and see how your internal organs are contributing to this process. And we'll start the easy way. We're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system that translates the motivations and the content of our mind into bodily states. And the way we teach this in this university and in the medical school is that there are two parts of this autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is there to deal with situations of emergency, when you need to conjure up a lot of energy and deal with a situation, typically a fight or flight situation. And the parasympathetic, as the picture shows, it's the opposite. Now let me tell you what happens in your body when you encounter a venomous reptile. Your palm is going to sweat. Your eyes are going to be acutely open. Your pupils are going to open to take in all the visual information. Your throat is going to clench. You may even scream. Your breathing is going to change. Maybe first you're going to just take a quick breath in and stop breathing, but then you're going to start to breathe more heavily. Your heart is going to beat harder. The liver is going to start to liberate sugars, which are going to pump into your muscles so that you can run or take the shovel. It's not going to be much salivation. Your mouth might feel dry. There's not going to be much digestion. Now let's compare that to this situation on the beach. You don't need to see much. You don't need to say much. Your lungs are going to be relaxed and you're going to breathe with a shallow breathing. Your heart is going to slow down. The muscles will not work at all. Therefore, the liver can take all that sugar that you ate for breakfast and turn it into love handles. There's going to be a bunch of salivation because you're going to be thinking about your next pina colada, and there's going to be a bunch of digestion and other functions. Now, this is the autonomic nervous system, the descending part, from the brain to the body. Do you think there is an ascending part? Well, of course there is. Otherwise, I wouldn't ask the question. So here, let's talk about the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is one of the biggest nerves in your body. It comes out from the base of the skull, and it goes down between the carotid artery and the jugular vein on both sides on the neck, and it goes down, and look what it does. It goes to the tongue, to the throat, to the airways, all the way down to the lungs, to the heart, to the esophagus, the stomach, the duodenum, the small and large intestine, liver, spleen, kidney, everybody. The whole catastrophe from the neck down is under the command of the vagus nerve. But you know what's interesting about this nerve? 80% of the traffic is ascending We don't teach that in the medical school, and we should. Because when we look at the vagus, it looks like a freeway with 2 lanes going one way, that this freeway is known about, and 8 lanes going the other way. 8 times more, actually just 4 times more, than the descending, what the ascending part of the vagus does the brain. And then we have to ask ourselves, who is the vagus listening to? Is it listening to the heart, the pump in the heart? That's how the heart is taught. That's how the heart is thought of ever since Leonardo da Vinci, or even from before. It's a pump. But we know better. Maybe there is a brain in the heart. Is it the brain in the pump that the vagus is listening to? Every little yellow dot there is a nerve cell. The brain has its own, the heart has its own brain. These nerve cells are not different from the nerve cells in the rest of the nervous system. They are important for something. We're just starting to understand how this intrinsic nervous system of the heart, in yellow here, how this intrinsic of the nervous system of the heart transmits information through the vagus to the brain. And the question is, okay, there is a brain in your heart. Cool. What does this information go up to? Where does it end in the brain? Because that will be the end of the autonomic nervous system. And it's interesting to see that the first part of this journey from the heart to the brain stops in the brainstem, which is an ancient part of the brain that contains networks for regulation and homeostasis, which means kind of keeping everything in working order. But from there, all this information gets distributed to the limbic system. And here I just put 2 elements of the limbic system, actually, the amygdala, the insula, and that thing in the green is the hippocampus. And the limbic system is the why of the brain. The limbic system is where all our emotions, all our motivations, all our drives come from. And this is a very interesting heuristic, because it doesn't come from a neuroscientist, it comes from Simon Sinek, and I liked it very much, because it summarizes in a way the brain and puts the limbic system in its legitimate place. So you think about the brain as these concentric circles, and on the outside is the what. What we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we do. A lot of apps that you can upload. And then closer to the middle is the how. Basal ganglia, cerebellum, other parts there that organize what we do, organize what we sense, sequence them, put them in order. We can do the same thing in many ways. But the doing, the reason for doing, the motivation, the drive, the oomph behind our doing comes from the why of the brain. And this is the limbic system. This is what I've been studying for a long time, because the emotions, the mental states that actually populate our mental life comes from the limbic system. And so now I have shown you that the vagus, this big nerve, it's not just a commanding nerve, it's a listening nerve. It listens to the internal organs, gets them into the limbic system. If this is true, then bugging the nerve a little bit, influencing it, interacting with it somehow, should have the kind of effects that we expect from the nervous system. And it does. People have invented this device called the vagus nerve stimulator. Surgically, you implant these coils around the vagus nerve, and then you implant a generator, pretty much like a pacemaker, and this generator is going to deliver electrical impulses in the vagus nerve in patients that have epilepsy that does not respond to drugs. And this mechanism cures epilepsy. A lot of epilepsy comes from the limbic system. And what was even more interesting is that some of these epileptic patients were also depressed. And when they received the vagus nerve stimulator, the symptoms of depression also went away. So here is proof that the vagus that brings information from the internal organ into the limbic system conditions and changes the neural function of the limbic system. Some of it may be pathology, like epilepsy, but some of it may be completely natural. It tells us that the state of the heart actually determines the state of the brain. It's not a coincidence, there's no wonder that we have all these metaphors in our language, like it was heart-wrenching. We had a heartfelt discussion. That person had a heart of a lion or a heart of a stone. And here's one of them. It's not a heart. It's a jasper conglomerate from the Proterozoic era, about 1 billion years old. I just put this in as a self-indulgence because I think geology rocks. And if I had another life, I would be a geologist. In fact, I do have a little side life when I am indulging in geology. And I thought, this is awesome because I find things like this on the internet. And then I'm thinking, I know some people who carried this in their chest. But talking about metaphors, and this is for you, Jim, we also have metaphors like, I had a gut feeling. Where's that coming from? Well, we have something called the enteric nervous system that is in connection with our brain and forms this gut-brain axis. This is an even bigger, more massive connection between the organs of the body and the brain. And I love this picture because it doesn't show that the brain sits on the top and sending these descending, or let's say condescending messages to the gut, but they're kind of on the same level. And you have heard last week Professor Vercelli tell us about what incredible stuff goes on in the gut. Well, let me tell you that the enteric nervous system is our third nervous system. So we have the regular one that does the what, and then we have the autonomic nervous system that I talked to you about, and then we also have this enteric nervous system that regulates the behavior of the gut without any control from upstairs, and it has 500 million neurons. That's more neurons than many animals and some people that I know. And then we have seen last week that in addition to the incredible complexity of the neural mechanisms that may take place in the enteric nervous system, we have all these bacteria, billions of bacteria living in the gut and determining very important features, not only our immunity, not only the way we are susceptible for certain allergens and certain diseases, but also our mood. We know now that there is a relationship between depression and anxiety and the microbiome in our gut. We know from a lot of animal studies, and the human studies are also coming out. Let me just mention one that came out recently from Belgium, where they have taken into the laboratory the microbiome of patients with severe depression and patients who did not have depression. And they found not only that there were different types of bacteria, different taxa, different species of bacteria in their gut, but also that even the ones that were shared between the healthy patients and the depressed patients were in different proportions. So this gut-brain axis is incredibly important. And it's not only neural, in yellow here, through the vagus, but it's also important in terms of endocrine regulation, hormonal changes, and also for the immune system, as you have heard from Professor Vercelli. And what is also very interesting, that the gut-brain axis uses chemicals and molecules that are shared between the body and the brain. Serotonin, for example, is that juice in the brain that everybody wants to have more of. Therefore, we pop Prozac and Zoloft and Lexapro and whatever we need to. But there's more serotonin in the gut than there ever was and will be in the brain. And then there's GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is an inhibitory transmitter in the brain. We don't exactly know what it does in the gut other than the transmission between the neurons, but there's just as much in the gut. And then there are those cytokines in the immune system, molecules that are inflammatory mediators. And it turns out that a lot of the disorders that we're dealing with, especially the chronic neurodegenerative disorders, maybe even schizophrenia, are going to turn out to be caused by neuroinflammations. So this relationship is extraordinary because on one hand you have anxiety, depression, even autism, and visceral pain. Pain is always in our head. And on the other hand, you have dysbiosis, this sort of unhealthy, poor diversity, poor number, and wrong kind of proportions of bacteria in the brain, and we have gastrointestinal disorders. We're starting to see how this all fits together. So now I would like to bring the strongest argument that is something that comes from me, because I have been looking at the amygdala for the last 20 years. The amygdala is part of the limbic system, and it's formed by, in a monkey, 6 million neurons, probably 10, 12 in us. And the same neurons talk and listen both to the brain and the body. From the perspective of a neuron in the amygdala that I listen to on a daily basis, it doesn't matter whether the information that it receives comes from the visual cortex or from the taste cortex or comes from the gut or the heart. And likewise, the output of a neuron from the amygdala makes its way both to parts of the brain that will decide how we're going to behave and what we're going to do, and whether something is appealing to us and we'll approach it, or it's very scary and we're going to avoid it, or that neuron is going to tell our palm to sweat because we're nervous. So, we get back to this idea of the mind and the body being connected bidirectionally. And the more we look at it, the more we realize that there is something here that we call circular causality, where the brain influences the body and causes a change in the body, and that change in the body feeds back through these closed loop, feedback loops into the brain. So let me give you an example. I want to have a heartfelt connection, an important conversation with somebody. I will seek eye contact. And when that eye contact is established, that will cause a certain emotional state. There's intimacy there. There's something at stake. Then I will say what I have to say, and probably I will be more honest, more vulnerable. I will say something deeper because I'm in that emotional state and because I'm engaged in eye contact, and this is a true interaction. And the person that I'm talking to is going to respond with the same currency. The conversation will be deeper, will be more honest, more truthful, and we close this loop. And I'm very interested in how this loop works. This is what I really want to work on. And I can, because I work with rhesus monkeys, and there's no language. And as Saint-Exupéry said, language, words are a source of confusion. There's an honest interaction there. We can bring this in the laboratory, and we can study it. We can look at this loop. And let me show you how we close in the lab the mind-body loop and gain certainty for the reality of this phenomenon. I want to show you this movie. These are two female monkeys grooming, and there's a baby between them. Not now, honey, mommy is busy. they're grooming, and at some point both of them notice the camera and they look towards us. Now I can take this movie and show it to a monkey. And I can ask the question, what happens in the mind and the body of this monkey? What is the monkey going to do with his body? And what can I find out about the mental processes that takes place? And I'm going to show you now the same video. And on this video, that green dot will move around. And wherever the green dot will land, this is where the viewer monkey, the monkey that looks at this video, is looking. This is where he decides to place his attention, his visual attention. And underneath, that little barcode-looking thing is actually marking the discharges, the electrical signals that a particular neuron in these monkeys' amygdala was signaling to the rest of the brain when the monkey was looking at this video. And your job is to figure out what this neuron cares about. Did you get it? I better show it again because there will be a test at the door. Oops, sorry. No, it doesn't want to play again. Okay, you got it. It's the eye contact, right? This part of the barcode, this part of the signaling shows that the animal established eye contact with these monkeys. And now we can ask the question, okay, you are the initiator of this eye contact because you move your eye there where their eye was. And then you establish this eye contact. And what happened then? So we listened to these neurons and we found them. Actually, this laboratory here at this university was the first one to report that there are such brain cells that respond uniquely to eye contact. So what happens downstream from these cells? The animal will feel an emotion. It will be under the impetus to communicate that emotion. It will monitor itself, and it will also monitor the receiver of his signaling, of his communication, and then it will adjust his behavior if it needs to, and then we'll go back to the eye contact. This is what we call a hypothesis. In science, we need to go and prove this. We need to go and design trials and controls and make sure that this is not just a figment of our imagination, but this is actually what happens. And in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to hit and run through 15 years, I wanted to say 15 hours, 15 years of research where we actually explored this loop, explored this circular causality between brain and body, between the expression of emotion, acting on emotion, and the perception of things in the brain. And I'll show you how this turns from hypothesis into reality. So let's just take the first thing about emotion. We can measure emotion by, for example, measuring the skin conductance in the palm of a monkey. Monkeys, like humans, can be put in a lie detector. Monkeys never lie, they don't know how to. They don't have a language, but they respond emotionally to images. They respond emotionally to eye contact, and that wiggly line that you see with the dotted lines indicate every time the monkey was looking at something, the higher the curve, the more excited the monkey was, the more the palm sweat, and when the palm sweats, the electrical conductance goes down, so electricity flows better, and that's what we're measuring. Does this excitement, this arousal, this emotion, does it lead to communication? We found that it does. We found that after about 2 or 3 seconds of eye contact, the monkeys that are engaged in eye contact, they're going to start to exchange facial expressions. And we published this, but I did my dirty little experiment in the hospital. There was no IRB approval. So what happens is that the hospital has these large corridors, and I can walk. And I make eye contact with innocent people who are coming next to me, and I look at them, and in the back of my hand, I count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, and at some point they're gonna say hi, hello, they're gonna smile. They can't stand it. Look at this woman looking at me, rudely staring at me. I gotta do something about it. Look away, smile back, ask her how she is. We're in America, where most of the time ask how are you, we don't really care about what the answer is, right? So monkeys do that too. So we know that they communicate, and we can measure that communication, because communication through facial expression happens through the facial musculature. The facial musculature, when it contracts, it makes an electrical signal. We can measure that, and here we measure only 5 of the facial muscles, and through different facial expression, yawn, fear, grimace, threat, lip smack, what are different standard expression among monkeys, and you can see that each facial expression produces a different type of muscular activity, of course, because we use different muscles. So we can objectively measure what happens and how the emotion that the monkey feels relates to its propensity of making one or another facial expression. And then we can ask whether the animal monitors itself. How do we monitor our facial expression? We don't see ourselves in a mirror. And it's interesting, again, something that we found in our laboratory and published recently, that the monkey amygdala contains neurons that listen to the skin of the face. It doesn't listen to the muscles. Somehow evolution, when we went to use the muscles of facial expression, we lost the sensors that tell the brain amount of stretch or tension that is on these muscles. And these muscles are very weak. They just have to move the features around. So basically, we know what facial expressions we make by being sensitive to how our face is wrinkled, crumpled, tensed, or stretched, how the skin moves around. That's how we know. And this data shows that when this monkey was using his muzzle and stretched the skin of the muzzle, every time he did that, when the blue line went up. And then you see this little barcode showing that that particular neuron that was listening to the muzzle area of the face signaled that the monkey was making a facial expression. So ladies, careful with the Botox. Not all the good things. Now, monkey monitors its own facial expression, but that facial expression is meant for communication, so you need to look at the effect. So the monkey monitors the social partner. This was the first thing that we published after I have established the laboratory here at the U of A, that the monkey amygdala contains neurons that respond selectively to particular faces. And not only that these neurons allow us to recognize different people, but they also differentiate between different facial expressions of the same person. So I know that I have in my own amygdala neurons that respond to the face of Dean Ruiz, for example. And there's going to be a separate set of firing of these neurons. This one eyebrow goes up with a little bit of squinting, or when 2 eyebrows go up. I know the difference. So these are the neurons that respond to fear response or a lip smacking response from the same monkey, a larger response for one facial expression and a smaller response from the other. Then the question is, okay, when we produce a facial expression, we have asked the question, did we attain the result that we wanted? Did we achieve our goal? Did we communicate what we wanted to communicate? Because if we didn't, we're going to adjust things. And this adjustment is very complicated. I don't think we're going to answer it from the amygdala, but I have wonderful colleagues at Johns Hopkins University and at Waterloo, and we decided to go the 21st century way and write a code, produce an artificial amygdala. This is a neural network, part of what we call artificial intelligence, and we built in a computer based on the properties of the neurons that we know from the amygdala, an artificial amygdala. And we put it in a little robot whom we called Amy G. Dala. Here she is. Amy G. Dala is made out of cardboard, Lego, toy car wheels, and she has a little camera, but she has a real amygdala. And we said, okay, Amy, when you see smile, approach the person, and if that person is frowning, go away from that person. Let me see how good your amygdala is. And here is Amy G. Dala responding to a wonderful engineer. Oh, but artificial intelligence. This amygdala predicted some functions, like if you're smiling too hard, the kisses are coming. So there's still some adjustment that we have to do when we build robots with amygdalas. But it's actually important to consider that robots are going to be part of our lives. They're going to interact with us. They're going to do a lot of things that we don't like to do, but they'll also be involved in healthcare, in training, in education. They have to understand our own emotional expressions, and they have to produce emotional expressions that are understandable for us. So working on the amygdala and robotics, it's not contradictory, yet some people don't believe that this is a good idea. This is in the honor of my friend Jonathan Seeley, who had a fantastic sense of humor. I can just see him saying this. So we came to this point where I have brought you evidence for this mind-body dialogue. I showed you why Descartes was wrong. He couldn't be right because we didn't know enough about the brain and the body. I have shown you that we can consider our bodies as extensions of our mind. That every square or cubic millimeter of our body is enmeshed in the nervous system. The nervous system listens to it, and it's talking to it, and we close this loop. So we have this little island of certainty, and that little island is surrounded by an ocean of uncertainty. Because in science, every time we conquer a little terrain, we came to immediate vicinity of the unknown, and the questions come at us. They come as a tsunami. What about this? What about that? What about the other? We have to ask the questions about this mind-body dialogue now in clever ways that is useful and helpful to us. How does the body keep score of trauma and neglect and emotional pain and repressed feelings? Can we be aware of this conversation? Can we listen to our bodies and be aware of what's going on and respect our bodies as we should, because they are the only and the best home that our mind ever had? Can we interfere in this conversation when it goes awry? Can we introduce messages on one or the other end of this loop, or actually loop doesn't have end, any point of this loop, that may be conducive to healing? Can we go away from this model of medicine when we fix this organ and we ignore the rest, and then something else breaks and we fix the other organ and ignore the rest? Can we turn this mind-body conversation towards healing, towards looking at the mind-body conversation as different aspects of the same gearbox that works together? Is it going to come from technology, from the conquest of microbiology and brain-machine interface, or is it going to come from understanding deeply thousands of years of human practice in Eastern countries where the culture was such that the body was not thrown in the bus, and people understood that things don't just happen to them, they are responsible for what happens both in their mind and their body. And there are an enormous range of questions, but out of these, I have chosen my own. I want to take this loop and study touch. I think touch is fascinating, and it's a quintessential mind-body loop question because we receive touch through our body and we give touch with our body, yet the interpretation of the significance and meaning of touch happens upstairs. In fact, touch is the first language that we ever learn. It starts by the protective embrace of a parent that sets up the brain to be able to trust and establish connections, meaningful emotional connections with others. And touch has its place in our everyday life. I know there's ways in which it can be abused, and again, we have thrown it under the bus, but touch belongs to our everyday life, belongs in showing care and concern and support for each other. It belongs in healthcare. It belongs in education. It belongs in our everyday life. And monkeys are the perfect animal to study this because they groom. And when they groom, they don't just remove detritus and parasites from each other, because if that were the case, they would groom 20 minutes and it would be over. But they spent about 20% of their daily life grooming each other. They use this to establish bonds, to show concern, to indicate to each other, you can count on me. And indeed, if one monkey is attacked, the likelihood of another monkey to come to its defense is proportional with the time they use grooming. So grooming is the way in which these animals establish positive emotional bonds. And they're so good at it that it even transcends species differences. They groom whoever they like. No sexual harassment there. So we can bring this into the laboratory. We can bring this grooming behavior into the laboratory and set up a whole new hypothesis, a whole new set of questions. Go through this loop and investigate with controlled trials and carefully designed experiments based on clear predictions. How does touch go through the mind-body loop? This is my journey. This is where I want to go. And I will get there. I am excited. And I trust that I will have the results that will come out from this work because I work at this university and I feel valued and I feel supported because I am in the Department of Physiology where the community knowledge about the body is more than I would ever need, because my work has been supported continuously and generously by the National Institute of Mental Health, but also because I have a fantastic team of people who have worked with me over the years and will continue to work with me, and whom we share a mission. But most importantly, I will succeed because I have the privilege to work with these amazing, clever animals that show me a mirror in which I can look only with humility, and whose ability to express emotion, to explore with curiosity and abandon, inspires and informs my own. Thank you.